tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki waho, tuia ki te whaiau, ki te ao mārama, e rongo whakaere ake nei ki te kōrero e nei ki te wānanga, ki te tuanui o ranginui e tui honei, turuturu ōwhiti whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e, hui e, tāi ki e. Ka ti ake, nei anō te reo o ngai tuahuriri, e re kaua tēnei ki a koutou, kua hono mai i tēnei o ngā rangi, o tēnei o ngā pai kōrero, kia aro atu rā tātou ki tēnei mea te whakamahana tanga o te ao, o tira tēnei au e whakamano atu nei ki a koutou, kua hono mai, koutou ngā maunga whakahi o te motu, koutou ngā awa tuku taniwha, nau mai e rarau mai ki tēnei o ngā huihuinga. Ka reo e tōro i ngā kōrero, hioi e tika ana kia tukumihi atu, kia tukumihi mai, nō reira koutou ngā kai kōrero, no tātou hoki te whiwhi kua whai wāhi mai koutou i tēnei o ngā rangi. Nō reira, e tika ana kia rere ngā mihi ngā ofa kia koutou. O tira, ka tahuri atu rā ki te reo Pākehā, kia pūrangi aho aku kōrero. Tēnā tātou katoa, good afternoon, and on behalf of Ngai Tuahuriri, and on behalf of our Upoko Runanga, Dr. Tamaire Tau, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to this Zooey, where we're going to have the privilege of having a bit of a wānanga around our future. And so the last year or so has shown us that we need to be able to adapt to change relatively quickly. And unfortunately, our climate and our ability to change to it is something that we're a little bit slow at. And so hopefully with the esteemed panel of speakers that we have today, we'll be able to have a bit of a wānanga in terms of carving out a pathway forward, but particularly in terms of creating a bit of change on campus at Te Whare Wānanga Waitaha, the University of Canterbury. And so on behalf of Mana Whenua, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you that have joined today, and particularly a bit of a mihi to those that were part of the SDG summit yesterday. Hopefully we'll get see a bit of synergy between some of the discussion we had in the different workshops and forums yesterday, as well as the panels that we'll be hearing from today. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to our DVC rangaho, Professor Ian Wright. Hea koe te wā. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nō mai toti mai o te whare wānanga o Waitaha. Ko ao te tumu tōrua rangahau, ko Ian Wright, taku ingoa, kia ora. I would also like to welcome everybody to this webinar around the future that New Zealand and the planet will need to undergo over the next 30 to 50 years. Many nations are on a pathway of carbon neutrality, with many nations making commitments due in 2050. New Zealand is no different, and we have a massive prospect of change in front of us. New Zealand is unique though. We are a bicultural nation where Māori bring a different perspective around knowledge, and particularly around intergenerational sustainability. Our economy is quite unique in the sense that one part of it is probably quite amenable to carbon neutrality, but another part of our economy is going to be quite difficult to meet those emission targets. Another context is New Zealand has social and economic inequities currently, and the demographics of today will be totally different from the demographics of New Zealand in the next 20 to 30 years. Māori and Pacifica will be a far more significant part of our population in that time period. If we are going to make a change as a nation over that period of time, there are three elements that we probably need to think about. Climate science is obviously the starting point, and I'm going to be bold enough to say that a lot of that is reasonably well known. Yes, more research is required about reducing uncertainty and having greater understanding around our regional effects around New Zealand and our surrounding oceans. but the physics of climate change is quite well known. Innovation of transforming where we are to a future state is reasonably well known. There are current technologies that will get us to that endpoint, and there are known technologies that we do need to develop or scale up to be economic at the required scale. But a key part of what I think we haven't talked about so far is the social and economic change that we as a nation will have to undergo. And it is all about people, people, and people. So this webinar is to try and draw out that intersection of climate science, available innovative technologies around clean energy and transportation, and importantly, what are the social and economic factors and cultural that will get us from where we are currently to a desirable or optimal position in 2050. That is an introduction for the intent of this webinar, and it is my great privilege now to introduce our 4 panelists who will each speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have an open question time. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Professor Bronwyn Hayward. Bronwyn is a UC academic. We're very proud of her. Her background is political science and international relationships, and Bronwyn has been a key lead author in the Ipcc process for some years now. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Rod Carr, who many of you will know, many of our colleagues from UC will know very well. Rod has a long record of insightful contributions around both private and public sector in New Zealand, and is currently chair of the Climate Change Commission with its recent recommendations to the government. Our third speaker is Professor Simon Kingham, who is a human geographer, and importantly is also currently seconded into the Ministry of Transport, providing that ministry with key scientific advice around how our transport sector will move along a pathway of carbon net neutrality. And finally, I'd like to introduce Dean Fraser, who is the General Manager of Transformations with Ngāi Tahu Holdings, and is very much leading iwi perspective, both in a business sense, but in a social transformation sense about what Māori and working alongside other New Zealanders will need to do to transform our society and economy into an optimal state in 2050. So with those introductory remarks, I'd like now to hand over to Bronwyn Hayward for her early thoughts.
Ka mihi mahana, kia koutou. Very warm greetings on a beautiful but locked down day. It's lovely to see everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm hoping that you are able to see the screen now. It begins with an image from my colleagues in the Physical Science Report in the Ipcc that just came out last month by Elisa Singer. It's and she titled it "Changing," about the physical changes in the world that we're seeing. Now, over the last, over the last 8 years and over the next 8 months, there will be a series of major reports coming out in a cycle. We call it the assessment cycle 6 from the Ipcc. This is the first one, the physical science. Then we look at mitigation, how we can make significant changes to reduce our emissions, and we look at adaptation, how effectively are we protecting our population. And then there have been a series of special reports around the oceans and the cryosphere, around how we could hold the world's temperatures at 1.5 and around how we use land. The reason that I'm pausing on the cover image for the physical science report is that it captures a lot of things that are changing within the Ipcc as well, and within the climate community, that I think are perhaps not really well understood yet. The Ipcc itself is a massive organisation, a volunteer organisation of scientists and social scientists and humanity researchers who are documenting the existing literature on change in our world. And I've found it a remarkably liberating and inclusive environment to work in. And I think the mere fact that the physical scientists are thinking very hard about how to work with artists and collaborators through communication in telling the story that they were trying to tell in the first report about the fact that our planet has already warmed 1.1 degrees more than it was back in the 1850s, 1880s, when we started using a lot of fossil fuels. It has also unequivocally been done by us, that it is now our responsibility, and we have had this effect. And I think the other really key thing that this report does is it also starts to introduce some of the new science. We often say, well, the science is settled, surely. We know that we understand that we're affecting change, but there are lots of new things. The unknown unknowns, the Antarctic ice sheet, the effect of methane leaks, the effect of large and dramatic and really significant shifts in atmospheric systems, and particularly the need for more local modelling to understand what's happening right down at the local city and community level. And then also what we're calling attributive science, or the science of attributing what's causing this. And there's two levels at that. So Freddie Otto and colleagues at Oxford Science, but here in New Zealand, many colleagues, including Sam Dean and Niwa, and many colleagues here at Canterbury and right around all of our universities, are looking at how we can understand the contribution that we have made to local and real-time disasters. Now, there's a next step for social scientists behind this, and here I'll stop speaking on behalf of the Ipcc and just talk now as a social scientist, because this signals a conversation that's extremely important about liability, damages, and loss, which is to come, which are conversations for ethicists, for lawyers, for communities. How do we understand the effects of the world on us now? So I suppose the thing that I've been really surprised about with the Ipcc is most of my life is spent at the moment on Zoom. But when we used to be able to meet in real time, the thing I have really benefited from, and the thing that I think is a real strength of the Ipcc that I would love to see us develop much more strongly in the New Zealand science and social science and humanities community, is a real commitment to diversity of thought, knowledge, gender, geographical and age perspectives. One of the things that the Ipcc has become so conscious of is that, in the words of Dr. Bob Bollard, the civil rights and environmental justice campaigner, that these issues are not just a marathon. Working on this, it's a relay marathon. We're going to have to pass these issues across many generations. So developing the capability for science into the future is extremely important. Now, today we're going to be talking about what it is. In particular, I've been asked to talk about some of the things that I think social science can contribute in new ways, and the humanities, to thinking about how we reduce emissions. But I want to say that one of the things that the humanities is good at is really asking questions, and same with social science. So really is the right question to ask, how do we reduce emissions? Going back to really asking what is the problem is significant, because as we've seen in the past, we've often assumed, oh, well, the problem is just that people don't understand the science. Or we've assumed, oh, well, the problem is just that we're not communicating well enough. Now, you frequently hear people saying, oh, well, the problem is just that we don't understand how behaviour is changing. But actually, many social scientists and humanities scholars would tell you that it's not a simple matter of just changing everyday habits and behaviours. A really significant book by Kari Norgard, the US-based but a Norwegian study about living in denial, has really significant echoes for many countries, including countries like New Zealand, where our economy and our society has been built and developed on high greenhouse gas emitting industries. And so what Kari looks at in a very empathetic and thoughtful way is how communities in Norway built on coal are struggling with the identity change, with the lifestyle, with the income, with the actual physical as infrastructure changes of moving away from coal, and also the enormous lobbying and influence that's going on in the background that makes it difficult for countries to move to just, and individuals to just change. We often talk about people being locked into high income lifestyles, but they're all, high carbon emitting lifestyles. And I think Simon will talk about this because there's lots of consequences for public transport. There's no point in telling people to take a bike if they are struggling with really busy roads, if they don't have access or they have a physical disability and they don't have any other public transport options. You're literally locked into using your car in many places in New Zealand. And yes, while we need highly responsible individuals who take a moral responsibility to affect change, we know that this comes with enormous anxiety-provoking reactions and emotions. It is extremely hard for individuals to carry the weight and expectation of change. And in fact, it's not a sustainable way to affect change. We need to think about how we actually affect collective change. So when the slogans say, you know, we need system change, not climate change, from the social science and humanities perspective, we're talking about a whole series of changes, either thinking about how our economic system changes, how we change the way in which our economies are based on high growth, and some of the classics include Tim Jackson's Prosperity Without Growth. How do you change your economic system in a way that is still actually going to enable communities who don't have enough at the moment to meet what they need? Kate Raworth's books on the new ecological economics have been really popular, and we've seen students walking out in university campuses around the world when they're frustrated with the way in which the economics is being presented at the moment. They're feeling that they're not getting enough of these of new conversations. And here at Canterbury, there's a lot of interesting work being done in economics around environmental economics, around ecological economics, and around psychology and behaviour change, that thinks about how we could do this more justly and more fairly. But here, as Ian said at the outset, here in Aotearoa, our constitutional context is different. Our fundamental framing of conversations is different. And so historians, cultural anthropologists, community activists, and those with Indigenous knowledge know that some of the systems that have to change are the systems that have been based on high extraction from a colonization process that is ongoing. But it has to be done in a way that respects fundamental rights and agreements that we have. Each country has its own pathway to think about how it gets towards a fairer way of reducing greenhouse gases. And so some of the new leadership that's coming out of that area, things like here from Kaitahu, Kara Sherwood O'Regan has been one of the early founding members of Te Ara Whatu, the youth Indigenous leadership group that's been campaigning for issues for Indigenous rights, but also issues for rights for disability, so that when we think about reducing emissions, we're thinking very carefully about who's leading that conversation, under what conditions, who's heard. I think some of the other really significant changes where legal justice scholars and others are able to contribute are signalled in things like Sarah Thompson's a landmark case where while they didn't win in 2017, she and her legal team held the government to account for its failure to uphold its commitments to the Paris Agreement. We still have not yet seen our country actually committing to a new greenhouse gas target that would be reduction target that would be within the Paris framework. And I'm grateful to the work of the Climate Commission in highlighting this. I hope we don't have to hold our breath until the November COP meeting to announce what we should have been announcing quite a long time ago. But in this context, there are many things that we can learn from within and around the realm and the communities of Aotearoa and the Pacific. And I just want to finish by highlighting one of the really fantastic initiatives that Josiah Tuamalale and others from the Pacific Youth Leadership and Transformation Organisation has done, which is to really bring together first Pacific youth leadership in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but then also all around the region, to upskill capabilities and skills in affecting and lobbying change. Because one of the key things about the Paris Climate Agreement is, yes, all of the world's, well, almost all of the world's governments agreed to try and hold the world's climate at 2 degrees, or certainly well below if we can, around 1.5 degrees warmer than it was back in the 1850s. But there are no legal mechanisms that make that binding on governments. All that is going to make governments affect change is public pressure. And for public pressure to happen, we need to have a public who understands the issues, who can sustain collective change, and who can have their voice effectively heard. And organisations like Pilot are doing an amazing job in actually upskilling and leading leadership change. So I might stop there. There's lots of other things I want to talk about how we integrate adaptation and emissions, but there's lots of interesting things I also want to hear about from my colleagues on the panel and from those who are listening in. So, nō reira, tēnā koutou. Oh, Ian, you're on mute.
Ian, you're on mute.
Sorry, let's now move on to Rod and hear his perspective, which I'm sure will be insightful given his role at the Climate Change Commission. Rod.
Ina mana ina iwi, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Rod Karaho, kai whakahaere, hei Pouarangi, Climate Change Commission. Thank you, Ian, for the opportunity, and Bronwyn for kicking off this really important conversation today. What I thought I'd do is start with a little factoid, talk about civilizations, a little about the work of the Climate Change Commission to date, and then the very significant opportunity for interdisciplinary study and the academic contribution to the challenge we face. So Bronwyn has quite rightly drawn our attention to the fact that our civilization, the one we have come to know and understand and live everyday lives in, is based on an extraordinary technology which emerged early in the 19th century, so the 1800s, when we began to realize that we could liberate the energy from fossil fuels, at that time mainly coal in the stationary and ultimately moving steam engine. But it was really in the 1850s when we figured out how to extract, refine, and use liquid fossil fuels, petroleum, that this game really got underway. It is estimated that one single barrel of oil, 166 litres of oil, does the equivalent of 10,000 hours of manual labour. That values labour at 1 New Zealand cent an hour. On the basis of that cheap, abundant, and completely misunderstood science about the collateral damage, we have built a civilization that has rolled back the night, enabled countries to choose not to have child labour, and has created a hyper-connected society where goods and services and people have been able to be moved extraordinary distances at what appeared to be very low costs. The challenge we now face is that we know for sure the collateral damage from the combustion of fossil fuels in the open air, which is contributing something in the order of 80% to global warming, is utterly unsustainable. And no longer is it a question of leaving something to the unborn generations to come, or even those of us who have grandchildren, leaving it to them. The impacts and effects of our combustion of fossil fuels and the way in which we create food on this planet are causing the climate to change around us now. The time to do something about it was long ago, and every year we delay will make it harder and more risky to deal with the challenge. So let me just for a moment try and conceptualize the scale of the transformation we need to make as a civilization. And it is at every level: individual, household, community, regions, nations, and across the globe. It could be likened to moving from polytheism to monotheism. It could be likened to the Reformation and its change from the Catholic dominance of its time. The insights of the Enlightenment about the role of the individual and humanity. Because if we are going to reshape civilization, it, in my view, will be the first time that it has been done deliberatively with intention, rather than merely an evolution of action, which with the benefit of hindsight, we have been able to identify and analyze. And it is this urgent need for deliberative action which challenges humanity in a way we have never been challenged before. We have seen change on the scale we need, but we have not commanded it, we have not managed it, and it has usually had some incredibly adverse consequences for communities, individuals, and whole nations in those transformations. The transformation we need needs to be inclusive, or it will not happen at all. It is in our own self-interest, in fact, to ensure that we identify those most adversely impacted, those least able to change, those most vulnerable to the consequences of what we are doing and to the need to do things differently. And that we, in understanding their circumstances, create the enablers and support so that they will be able to participate and gain advantage from the transformation which is about us every day. So that's why the call and cause for interdisciplinary study is so important. That somewhere we need to use the creative minds, the curiosity, the challenge, and the contest of ideas to bring forward alternative views of our place on this planet, of how we will sustainably interact with our ecosystem, of how we will ensure that not only individuals, households, and communities are able to reduce their dependence on emissions for prosperity, but how we are able to get nations and industry to recognize and play the part they must play in the transformation. No emission reduction is too soon. No emission reduction is too small. But we need to leverage all of the actors and tools that we have come to create. We need markets to do the best they can to play their part, but we need to understand the consequences of price alone determining the allocation of resources. We need regulation to play its part in helping reduce barriers and create enablers sooner than they might otherwise have become available and known. For New Zealand, the work of the Climate Change Commission has helped simplify what we must do if we are to achieve our domestic targets and statutory obligations. We must first decarbonise energy production, electrify where we can, and generate electricity from renewable sources. We must decarbonise low and medium temperature process heat. We must decarbonise ground transportation. We must figure out how best to use a reducing amount of greenhouse gas emissions from the production of meat and milk protein. And we must prudently use afforestation where appropriate to draw down carbon dioxide that has been and will continue to be emitted into the atmosphere. The work of the Climate Change Commission shows that there are technically feasible, economically affordable, and in our view, socially acceptable pathways, plural, for New Zealand to achieve its targets for 2030 and 2050. And those targets embedded in legislation are quite simple. A reduction of 10% in biogenic methane emissions from their 2017 level by 2030. With known practices, we believe that is achievable alongside some land use change without any significant reduction in production of meat and milk protein. And the other target is that by 2050, we will have reduced biogenic methane emissions from their 2017 level by 24 to 47%. Quite a broad range, but that's the best science we have to stabilise our contribution to global warming. And by then also to be net zero in long-lived gases, and not only in 2050, but in the decades that follow. So while there is a point target and a milestone to achieve, let's not kid ourselves that we can plant trees and continue to pollute. We must reduce our gross emissions, and we need the science and technology to be adapted and adopted at pace. And there comes the issue of understanding from psychology, from philosophy, from legal and ethical training. What are the barriers to more rapid adaptation and adoption of solutions? What are the impediments where appropriate interventions can get the buy-in, reduce the alienation, and ensure that we make the progress that we must make? Ever higher ambitions that fail to be achieved through lack of action will not get us to where we need to go. Ambition matters, for without a vision, without a goal, without a target, it is unlikely our journey will be a success. But setting ambition that is unachievable, unrealistic, is not going to contribute to the buy-in that will be critical. The interdisciplinary studies that can happen in New Zealand and in our universities has a comparative advantage over other countries. What is known as our power distance ratios are some of the smallest in the world. We can access people easily. We can fill a room and cover all domains and disciplines. Our networks reach well beyond our national borders. We are able to leverage those we know and those who we have a respect for, not only to bring home and deploy insights here, but to take to the world the insights that we have. And there is absolutely no doubt that we can learn through others within our communities, from Mataranga Māori, from those who were never as alienated from sustainable practices as our Western energy-intensive fossil fuel burning society has become. But there is a whole sense of urgency. And one of the issues is the pace at which academia is often seen to make its contribution. The climate waits for no one. The science is clear. The policy for New Zealand is relatively easy and simple to identify. Getting actors to act and act for decades to come is going to be an act of political will, as well as insight into our human nature and the lens that we see the world and our part in it through. I have no doubt this planet will survive. I have no doubt that human beings will survive. The challenge is what kind of civilization will we deliberately create, and have we left ourselves the time to manage a transition to a better, cleaner, greener, healthier, and more sustainable world? Because that is a vision of a future which gives me great hope and great optimism that climate action is about a better future, better than it is today. It is, however, a call to action now. Kia ora.
Thank you, Rod. Now we'll move to Simon and hear his insight. Simon.
Hi everyone, I'm going to share my screen as well, I hope.
Hopefully you can find the button to make the thing larger.
Okay, can everyone see that? Can you see the proper screen? Yeah, good. I'm just going to talk, as Ian said at the beginning, my name's Simon King. I'm a Professor of Geography at the University of Canterbury, and I'm also Chief Science Advisor at the Ministry of Transport. I should actually add I am the only science advisor, so I don't have a little raft of underling science advisors. I am the science advisor. But I think that kind of perhaps slightly answers one of the questions that has been posted, that I think people do listen to. People still not in presentation mode, people are saying. I'm going to swap, see what happens. Okay, what's happening now? Is that working? I'm going to look at the comments and check that. Can someone say yes, it's in presentation mode? Worse, okay.
Yeah.
Got it the wrong way around. I'm going to try again. Okay, swap presenter. Is that better before? Better, right? I'm going to stick with that one. Good. Okay, so I'm going to carry on. In the ministry, as Rod's talked about, the Ministry of Transport's part, I'm going to really talk about transport emissions and what we're trying to do about the transport emissions. And there seem to be three things we can do to reduce emissions. One is to improve energy choices, so the bit on the far right. And that basically is electrifying the fleet. And obviously there's a lot of work going on. Many of you will have seen what is sometimes called the rebate scheme. There's emission reduction schemes, etc. There's talk about biofuels, hydrogen, and a whole bunch of other things. That's one part of it. The two parts on the left that the ministry talks a lot about are avoiding traveling. So this is actually traveling less. So in many ways, what COVID has done is shown what is possible. So when multiple people can't travel around, we see a significant reduction in our emissions. To some extent, much of that is outside the realm of the transport sector, because it's actually places like workplaces, saying people can work at home. It's home deliveries of shopping, etc., so people don't have to go to the shops. So it's a thing we call transport or travel demand management. And then the middle part is shifting our modes. This is where we're trying to encourage people to use more environmentally friendly modes. So we want more people using public transport, walking, cycling, using rail, and using shared mobility. And I'll touch on some of them in a minute. And the assumption is that rail and public transport and shared mobility are all electric. So they are both the improve, but also the shift. So if you can shift into any of those modes, you are reducing emissions significantly. And the Climate Commission did some work and tried to estimate what proportion you had to do of each. And the Ministry of Transport's done some. And the ministry's view is that around 61% of our reduction emissions can be done through improving. So in other words, shifting people into electric vehicles. And 39% actually needs to come through avoiding traveling and shifting. Now, the Climate Commission's estimates are slightly lower for avoiding shift, I think. So let's assume it's somewhere between the two. So it's somewhere between 25 up to maybe 40%. So it's a significant amount of the reduction in emissions cannot be achieved just by electrifying the fleet. It actually has to be achieved by behavior change. It has to be by us changing the way we travel and changing the amount we travel. I'm now just going to talk mainly about the shift bit. So how do we encourage or incentivize people to change their mode of transport? And so how do we shift? How do we shift behavior? Ultimately, that's what we want to do. We want to shift people into different modes of transport. But also, therefore, how do we have to shift people's values and perceptions about different modes of transport? Some of you may have seen this quote from the beloved Mrs. Thatcher, who said a man who, and I think, well, maybe it's ironic she said a man, but I'm sure she would have said a person who beyond the age of 26 finds themselves on a bus can count themselves a failure. There's an argument about whether she actually said that, but it is attributed to her. And these are the sorts of attitudes we need to change. We need to make public transport more like this view of the Mayor of Bogota, Gustavo Petro, who said a developed country isn't a place where the poor have cars, it's where the rich use public transport. And there's a lovely picture of Sir Paul McCartney using a train in Britain. And so what we're trying to do is, how do we change perception of public transport so that everybody feels they would rather use public transport? In other words, it becomes the transport of choice for everybody, not just poorer people, not just certain types of people, but everybody. And we don't actually know that. We're struggling with that in New Zealand. And it's partly, in many of our cities, we have no public transport system. And in many of our cities, we have underdeveloped public transport systems. But even if we change them, how do we get people to change their attitudes to say, actually, we want to use them? We also need to change the modes of transport, and we need to do more research to understand some of these. So we have traditional buses, and in Auckland and Wellington, we have trains. But we also have flexible public transport services. So the top right picture is from Timaru, where they have a flexible bus service. It operates more like a taxi. Well, it's like a hybrid between a taxi and a bus, and it's actually incredibly successful, but we've only got the one system in New Zealand. Or should we be looking at technologies like trackless trams, which have the plus of buses in that they are very flexible, but they are supposedly have the feel of a train or a tram service, and of course, and they're all electrical or battery operated. So can we start developing some of those technologies and trialing in some of our cities? This technology is mainly in China at the moment. It's not in anywhere else in the world, although there is a trial starting soon in Perth in Western Australia. So maybe we should be trying some of this stuff and getting involved in some of this. What about micromobility? Micromobility is very contentious. A lot of people love it and a lot of people hate it because it gets in the way of pedestrians, etc. And there's lots of conversations happening about this, and it's a really contested space. And one of the solutions we're starting to see in places like Auckland is where they're actually providing scooter parking. So one of the issues with scooters is where they're left, and they're dangerous and they're left on pavements. But actually we need to start coming up with really good solutions to some of this rather than just seeing them as a problem. And the follow-on from that is actually this idea of shared mobility. So people not owning vehicles, but purchasing time of vehicles. So you can have City Hop, or in Christchurch we have Zilch, and then we have Lime scooters. So you don't own the vehicle. And in other countries in the world, they have schemes where you buy your transport as a service. So they call it mobility as a service. And you purchase certain amounts of time of different modes of transport, and you have shared fleets of vehicles, but nobody owns a vehicle. And of course, the vehicles are newer because they're circulating through the system, they're therefore cleaner and better, but also we know that when people have to make decisions about each part of their journey, they actually make very different decisions, because they actually go, well, for this journey, walking is the best option, or using the bicycle, or using a scooter, rather than having a car parked in your driveway and the default is, well, I'll use it because I've already paid for it. So there's some novel solutions there. But we also need to change the way our cities look. We need to, and this is from the Ministry of Transport's document, so we need to move from a system where it's all about fast movement and less place to a system where it's about slow movement and more place. So it becomes more attractive for people to use. And when you make the environments more attractive for people to walk and cycle, they actually choose to walk and cycle. So for many people, the biggest barrier to walking and cycling is actually that it doesn't feel safe, it doesn't feel nice. Yes, of course, there are many people who live too far from destinations, and walking and cycling is not going to cover all journeys, but it should certainly be having a greater mode share for many of the journeys we are taking. And so you go from the images at the bottom left, you can go from that sort of situation to the bottom right, and that's in Barcelona, and you get a very different sort of feel. The problem is that we have to change people's attitudes to this. In New Zealand in the last 2 years, we've had the Innovating Streets scheme where the New Zealand Transport Agency has provided funds for local councils to trial things. And there's been uproar in some of them. People talking about the road adornment labelled childish and dangerous. And this is where people put paint on a road. People talk about traffic calming. There was actually cases in Auckland where a temporary traffic calming scheme was put in place, and people were removing bollards and things overnight with forklift trucks. And many of these, there were almost wars in some of these communities. And these were for very minor trials of things. So we have to change the way we do these. And the reality is at the moment, we actually don't quite know how to do it. We know we need to do it. And we know that if you read all the documentation that's coming out of government at the moment, we're going to have to do it. But we somehow need to make it more palatable to people and more acceptable. And one way to do that is actually to look at some of the co-benefits. And so some of the work at the moment is starting to say, well, let's look at some of the co-benefits. And this figure is from the Ministry of Transport's Outcomes Framework. And they talk about these 5 outcomes. So it's inclusive access, healthy and safe people, environmental sustainability, resilience and security, and economic prosperity. And actually, when we talk about many of the things we need to change to meet our greenhouse gas emission targets, they actually create healthier, more pleasant streets. So if you can create an environment that reduces emissions by encouraging walking and cycling, you actually also create an environment which is healthier. You can create an environment that improves mental health because it encourages people to communicate with their neighbours and interact with their neighbours. So you get many of these other co-benefits rather than just saying this is a climate change initiative. This is a climate change initiative that also has all these other benefits. And so what we're starting to see is they can have economic benefits, other environmental benefits, health benefits, etc. And within all that, we need to do it as a just transition. We need to make sure that the people who are the less well off in the community are not disadvantaged by this, and in many ways use it as a way to reduce the gap, the inequalities we have in this country. And so many of the policies that are being looked at are ones that people are saying, well, while we do these climate change policies, let's also try and make sure that we actually bring up those at the bottom of society and reduce the gap between rich and poor. And it is possible, but it is also essential. And that's why some of the conversations about the feedback scheme came in about, is this just a subsidy for the wealthy, etc. So we need to keep having those conversations, and we need to understand the impacts of these different policies on different communities. And ultimately, in many transport policies, we actually have this mantra that build it and they will come. And what we've been doing for the last 50 years is building lots of roads and providing lots of infrastructure for people to drive everywhere. And so not surprisingly, people drive everywhere. And if you look at other countries in the world, and the best example is always the Netherlands, they've actually invested heavily over a number of years, over 30, 40, 50 years in cycling. And now lots of people choose to cycle. And if you look at places like Switzerland, where they've invested heavily in public transport infrastructure, people choose to use public transport. They're not forced to, they're not being pushed out of their cars, but they are making logical choices because the best way to travel in those countries is by walking, cycling, or using high quality public transport. But they have invested over a number of years. And if we want to do these sorts of things, we need to change the way we invest, because ultimately, if you invest in good alternatives, people often choose to use them. So that's all I'm going to say in my few minutes.
Thank you very much, Simon. And lastly, I'd like to invite Dean to give his thoughts.
Kia ora koutou katoa, he mi atu, kia koutou, i tēnei ahi, i atu Corbyn o tō mihi, at the whānau Nai Tuahuriri, ko waio. My name is Dean Fraser. I guess I'm going to try and, I don't have a presentation, and I don't have the smarts of Rod Carr. So going last is going to be disappointing for everyone if you're expecting something amazing. But I thought I would reflect on a few sort of thoughts and some of the challenges facing Ngāi Tahu, and reflect on some of the comments that Bronwyn, Rod and Simon made. I guess I, from a background point of view, come from humanities, a former psychotherapist who then delved into, and I was reflecting when Rod was talking about oil, and realised that I have worked for 2 Fortune 500 oil companies during my career and have contributed significantly to the current problem. But on reflection from what Simon was saying, I've also been full-time on an electric bike for 7 years. In fact, I remember when I lived in Canada for my big oil company, that in fact, I did have a car share. We didn't own a car at that point, and we used a car sharing company like Zilch, and that was our full-time mode of transport. And to reflect on what you were saying, that we should have different models, Simon, is critical. The issue is we're moving too slow, and in Christchurch, you may see 2, maybe 3 Zilch cars, which makes it very, whereas, you know, 10 years ago, I lived in North America, I would find one of those cars within 100 meters from my front door. So how do we invest? And when you talk about investing in different modes of transport, requires long-term thinking of investment outside the realm of political cycles. And like Bronwyn reflected on, she talked about true intergenerational change. was going to reflect on a few, I guess I had sort of some notes here that I'd sort of been writing. I sort of bagged to go last today so I could figure out what I was going to say. And I sort of come up with sort of 5 key points that I kind of are reflective and then can share some examples around how Ngaitahu is facing these challenges head on. Now I think about a whakatauki that we have, and it says toi tū te marae o tānei, toi tū marae o tangaroa, toi tū te iwi. And really, you know, if we talked about the sustainability of our forests and the sustainability of our oceans, that will look after us as people. And one of the things that slides that you put up, Bronwyn, albeit not on full screen, was a book. There's a couple of things. Sorry, I didn't mean to point that out. Around donut economics. One of the presentations around donut economics. And certainly when Ngaitahu's looked at its response to climate, we have not simply looked at what is a carbon strategy, because we have looked completely at the whole, that everything has an interrelationship with each other, whether that be waste, water, people, and how that incorporates all of our values. You also brought up a book cover that talked about one of those values around kaitiaki. And I wanted to just, I guess, pause for a moment to think about what that means. And I go to lots of forums with government departments who throw out words like kaitiaki and mana whenua and manaaki. And what does that truly mean? For us, these are not values and words that are written on a piece of paper. These break down to fundamentals about how we live. These break down, if I break down the words manaakitanga, which I'm sure flows around the University of Canterbury like nothing else, as a statement that people use in government departments of, yes, we will use manaaki. Well, what does manaaki mean? Well, it sort of breaks down to a few things. It's mana, and everyone sort of knows what mana is. You know, everything that is a tonga, or everyone or everything has an element of mana. And I think about the aki, so it's mana aki tanga, and aki is to encourage. So what is in fact the encouragement of mana? How do we live that value in our everyday life? How is the value of whanaungatanga, and I talked in Bronwyn reference donut economics, and in fact the value of whanaungatanga talks about the interrelationship of all elements, that it is not just in fact making changes around riding electric bikes, and Simon and I, because we live 100 meters from each other, are going to share a zilch car together. You know, how do we in fact embody this? I talk about the fact the word, as I break down the word you put up, Bronwyn, around kaitiaki. And what does that break down into? Well, the word T of kaitiaki, so ignore the first part, kai, because in English, what does that mean? It kind of means it's a doer. In English language, that the kai part means it's a person who is the doer. But the T part of that is to enhance or take care of what we protect. And yeah, the T is to enhance something, and the aki is to take care of something. So what in fact is kaitiaki? And how do we do that and live that in everyday life? We talk about words like rangatiratanga, and people use that, you know, certainly in the world that I live in as a Ngaitahu world often. And what does that break down? Or ranga comes from the word rāranga, which is to weave. And tira is the strands. So rangatiratanga, people talk about leadership. Well, it's actually how you weave the strands of people together, how we weave knowledge together, and how we weave communities together. And as we sit on this forum, which I'm looking down, there's 136 people on, we are starting to think about the future generations of how we in fact show rangatiratanga, of which each of us has the opportunity to do that, to in fact weave people and communities and knowledge together. There's lots of these values. I'm aware of time, so I won't go down to breaking down all of those. So I think one of the challenges is, in fact, how do we integrate? And Rod talked about Mātauranga Māori, is how do we integrate or, in fact, acknowledge with the sciences or with policy makers or legislation or management practice around how do we get the true integration of Mātauranga Māori, and to have it more than just a mere catchphrase under the University of Canterbury or any political studies department or whatever else, then actually how does that truly get integrated across policies, legislation, and practices that we look for across our society? So that would be one of the challenges. The obvious challenge that comes to us is Ngāi and one of the things we unfortunately often become famous for is our commercial success. And how do we find the balance between our commercial aspirations and, in fact, these values that we have? And we're not waiting, what did you say? I don't know whether it was Rod or something. Climate does not wait for anybody. And I don't wait, and we don't wait for policy makers to make change either. We take that value of rangatiratanga to weave leadership together. And we really challenge and I lead our implementation of our climate strategy and plan for right across the Ngāi Tahu group. And how do we look like? How do we be leaders and not wait for policy makers? I once lived in Malaysia for several years, and it fascinated me that everyone just ate food and then threw their litter on the ground. And I talked to the locals that I had built really great relationships with, and they talked about, why do you, because I couldn't understand that as a Kiwi, we would never do that. And they said, oh, well, the government hasn't told us to do that. And it blew my mind that we have to wait for the government to tell us not to litter. And therefore, I do not have to wait for the government to tell me what emission schemes I need to deliver to or what change I need to make in my community. In fact, and I'll give it some examples around this. Some people will say, well, Naito, you own quite a lot of dairy farms, which is challenging. And we could sell those dairy farms, but to what end? Because the cows will in fact still exist, whether we own them or not. So what we have, and so I'll give some examples of the commitment that we believe that we can do in relation to dairy farming. For example, for those science buffs amongst us, you walk across one of our paddocks, we have a lysometer in the ground. For those who don't know what a lysometer is, it's kind of a big bunker. You walk across a paddock and suddenly you go out and above you there is cows walking around. Well, what that does is it allows us to track every bit of sunshine and rain and urine and feces, and it tells us what do we do to be the kaitiaki for that land. How do we do differently? So our significant investments, so how can we be much greater, and how do we deliver and show that rangatiratanga? How do we bring that value to truly bring that to life? I can tell you that we've committed to, and hey, we are on a journey too, but we have commitments to reducing to zero synthetic fertilizers. Or we have a jet boat company that talks about that we've invested significant money to electric jet boats. But I'll reflect on Simon's part before when he talked about creating a shift in different modes of transport. We also have the privilege, and it is a privilege, to have the opportunity to influence commercial things, and we are a property development company. So we start to challenge our designs and the fundamentals of our designs. And I work with our property development company, says from now on, every property development that we do, and in theory, not in theory, in fact, what you do is you upset an ecosystem. We have now committed to say we will no longer do that, that every time that we touch a piece of dirt that has an ecosystem in it, we must change that. We must enhance that ecosystem, so incorporate it into our design, our migratory paths for birds and fresh water, but also to Simon's point, how in fact do we make the shift to modes of transport and to make communities that enhance and give people the opportunity for accessing those. So that's kind of challenge number 2 for Ngāi Tahu, is balancing and really integrating true rangatiratanga between our commercial operations and our tikanga and our things. And this sort of, this challenge is not new to us. You know, I reflect back on someone called Hone Tiko from Onuku over the bay, you know, in 1830s, adapted and traveled to Europe and was a scholar in 1830 who was proficient in English, who knew our world was about to change back then and quickly adapted and says, what do I need to do to continue to trade, but also to hold strong to the values that we hold and live by today. I guess the third challenge I'd like to reflect on, and it's been mentioned by my other very smart people on this call, around intergenerational thinking. And I am blessed with the privilege of being able to think always in what are the impacts of 100 and 200 years from now, and how do we truly consider that and implement that? The challenge for us is that whilst we can think for 100, 200 years, our policymakers just surely can't. And while our policymakers will make change based on, you know, political cycles, we must continue to make real change in how we operate. And it is both a challenge to get the balance right, to allow us to work with partners when we are seeking to be much more aspirational in our thinking. Another challenge I was thinking around was, if I reflect on the statistics, someone's asked a question. Dean, can you repeat that? I'll come back to that in a second. Remember to ask me that again, Anna. Is the population growth of Māori and Pacifica people. And if I look out for another 2 generations and the impacts and the population growth of Māori and Pacifica people, and the value set that they will in fact have, and the value set that will dawn the corridors or the virtual lectures of the University of Canterbury, and how their value set and how we integrate that into the sciences, and how the value set that coming from those communities will be enhanced and integrated into the sciences, the humanities, and how we do that, and how that we provide an environment that can be embracing of those different viewpoints that everyone has talked about. And I guess the last challenge is how we embrace technology. We have a Ngāi Research Centre connected through the university, which is, you know, looks at also how we partner across regions and how we partner to solve problems for both NZ Inc. and globally. These are not issues that Ngāi wants to solve for themselves, but how do we solve these for NZ Inc. and have a very open way to share the responsibilities and share the research and bring in people who might have different mindsets to research and bring those technologies into our community. I'm pausing for effect because I think they are the 5 key challenges. There's many others, as everyone knows. So thank you for an opportunity to speak for a few minutes.
Thank you very much, Dean. So hopefully people have found the question and answer section of this webinar, and I'm just going to facilitate a series of questions here. We may or may not get through all of them, but the one that has the most likes at the moment is from Brianna, and the question is, do you think the government is listening to researchers? And I might start with you, Simon, first, given you have a foot in both camps.
I guess I can only speak for the Ministry of Transport, but I like to think, and I genuinely do think, they are doing pretty well. So one of the things we've done recently, we've gone around the country to all the universities talking to researchers. They've actively engaged with researchers on a number of issues, including their climate change strategy. And they're currently been engaging on their autonomous vehicle strategy. So I think they are. I can't speak with all government departments. The other thing I'd say is I actually think there's also quite a bit of the onus on the researchers. And dare I say that not all researchers are particularly keen to engage with government, sadly. So I think the onus lies on both sides. I think government needs to be receptive to talking to researchers. And I think researchers also need to be open to actually engaging with governments. And those that do are generally welcome, and certainly in transport, I would say they are, and I think they are genuinely seeking to make decisions based on evidence at the moment. And generally the feedback I'm getting on some of the stuff they're doing, even the more radical academics are going, I think what you're doing at the moment is pretty good. It's the we being the Ministry of Transport.
Bronwyn, do you want to reflect on this question?
There are a couple of things. It's been a privilege to interview a lot of parliamentarians when they retire. But what shocked me is how many people in public life feel trapped, and that they feel that they couldn't implement the change that they wanted to. And I think we put too much expectation, building on something Dean said about leaders to do things. There's a really marvellous element of New Zealand's democracy is that we are so small and we can have really immediate influence on policymakers. We can have really immediate influence on change, and we, in a way that working for 4 years on these topics in Britain, it was just, there was amazing thinking, but it was so hard to affect change. Here, I sometimes feel like we're not having enough of the debate, but you can really affect change. And I would like to thank the school strike and the groups like Te Ara Whatu and Pilot for just seizing the moment and pushing them through. I mean, if Generation Zero hadn't developed that Carbon Zero Act when the Labour government found itself in a coalition agreement suddenly, there would have literally been no legislation ready. They had already drafted it. So I think one of the things that we just try and emphasise to students here is that you have not overemphasising the agency of the individual, but collectively in a community or in a business, you can make such a difference in New Zealand. I think you should never underestimate it. And I'm grateful every day for the conscience and critic protection that you get for speaking out, but it's difficult.
Rod, I guess you might sit on the other side of the fence, well, not fence, but you have a particular view?
I think this is a government that wants the evidence in order to support the decisions. I think the scientific evidence is pretty compelling about the cause and what we need to do about it. I think it would be good if we could help our leaders and decision makers with answers to some of the questions about how do we get more decisions made to reduce the barriers and improve the enablers so that we individually and collectively can make the better choices that many people want to make. So I think if it was purely a matter of evidence alone, nobody would take up smoking. We'd probably all drink a lot less than we do. But we need the broader base of interdisciplinary evidence of understanding about effective leadership as we develop the policies to get the action done. So I think, yes, it's a government that does want to see the evidence, but we have to be careful that we don't use that as an excuse for delay, that the pursuit of ever more data, the pursuit of ever more precise answers is going to leave us with too little action time, and it will be too late.
Okay, thank you. Dean, do you want to have a say on this question?
No.
Okay, that's honest. I guess just to back up Rod's point, I guess COVID is another example where the government action has been directly driven by data and modelling. So I would support Rod's view that this government is open to listening to the research community in its broadest sense. So the next ranked question is from Sunny, and he's, well, he or she, I'm not sure, is asking the question, the twin threats of climate change and biodiversity loss are obviously linked. we can't solve one without addressing the other. So the question is, what does New Zealand Aotearoa need to be doing to protect natural ecosystems? And I think we heard from you, Dean, about what Ngāi Tahu is doing around its current property development, and we might sort of come to you first in giving a bit more detail around that.
Yeah, so like I says, and I think Rod mentioned it before, we all have to start to take individual accountability, because this is it is people that make up communities and societies, and each of us has responsibilities as mums and dads and wives and brothers and sisters, and for some of the young people that will be on this call will be leaders, and Simon, Rod, Bronwyn and myself, you will be our bosses one day, I'm sure. So all the things that, so we need to just, for us, it's really about taking sort of active leadership now, and like making significant changes in relation to how we do property developments and how that affects our ecosystems, and ensuring that that their ecosystems are better than when we left it. I talked about other initiatives we're doing. Some of those are around education for our whānau members, and we have 70,000 whānau members, you know, where it's important for us to take responsibility to how do we help and educate those who might be unsure about how they can affect their ecosystems or their footprint. Some of it's around, like I said before, some of the initiatives we're doing in farming, whether that be via lysometers or our commitment to reducing to 0% of synthetic fertilizers, and looking at regenerative agriculture, and how we do that. So for us, looking at viewing the environment that we live in as a whole, not just our emissions, not just our waste, but our waste, our emissions, our water, our whānau, all of these we must take into consideration. So it's probably, that's not a very good answer in relation to what policies. And I guess for us in Ngāi Tahu, this is about our business policies or our iwi policies, as opposed to what government it is, and showing us, we're taking it a step further too. And obviously you can imagine of an organisation our size, we have lots of people that we work with, organisations, communities, partners, and we've made a commitment that every single partner that we currently have and in the future will have to be on the have both be reporting their emissions, capturing and reporting their emissions, and have reduced their emissions to the appropriate levels in terms of the climate commitments by 2035. If in fact partners don't want to do that, they will no longer be partners.
Thank you. Bronwyn, do you want to add some thoughts around this interrelationship between carbon emissions and natural ecosystems?
They're very close. I think there's a lot of new work around not just the ecosystem services and not just thinking about the way in which ecosystems support life, but the relationships between human and non-human nature, whether we're looking at that through an Indigenous lens, whether we're thinking about how we live, whether we're thinking about the psychology of how we live. It's, Rod mentioned it being a huge fundamental shift. It is a different way of being back in the world, but it is also going to need legislative change. And we've seen the beginning of a Yellow Jackets movement here, or an attempted Yellow Jackets movement, with the development of groundswell. It's going to be really difficult for the farming industry to manage that, because if you just get active resistance to any of the deep change that we need, then it's a little bit like it's exactly like the COVID vaccination denial. There's no point in rushing headlong at it and saying, well, you're all stupid and you don't understand it. But to understand that to protect our ecosystems, we actually need to take legislative change. And there we do need it at a national level. We do need governments that are going to be brave and take this at a national level, knowing that there's going to be really strong pushback. And then we have to speak out about why that matters. That's not exactly like Dean was saying. I don't feel that's a very helpful answer, but I am extremely worried about the polarization that we're seeing rapidly developing right now. And I think it's because it's a very un-New Zealand thing to be polarizing like this. And I think it's partly because of our media communication at the moment. We're all individualized, we're at home, people are going down rabbit holes of reading stuff. They're missing the opportunities to just interact with friends and family who think a bit differently. It's so easy at the moment to be siloed to people who are reinforcing your worldview, and the serendipity of just meeting another farming family who actually have a slightly different take on an issue, or living in town and meeting a farming family who are struggling with something, all that helps you bridge change. At the moment, it's not just getting our ecosystem in touch with, or our communities in touch with their ecosystems, but getting our communities in touch with each other is going to be critical.
Rod, I noticed you nodding your head, so I'm sure you want to offer a view.
So I have very little expertise on the wider agenda of biodiversity, but from the climate change point of view, there are a couple of things which are really interesting, because if we don't get them right, this gets harder for us. The first is the whole pest in the New Zealand forests and bush, the rabbits, the possums, the whole 9 yards, that predator-free New Zealand by 2050 is as much a climate action as it is a biodiversity issue. And if we really are going to take this thing seriously, we need the research, we need the technology, and we need the funding that would essentially help those in provincial and rural New Zealand be resourced with the technology and the cash to suppress and, at a best hope, eliminate the incredibly destructive pests which are eating our carbon store. So we don't even have good measures yet of the extent to which that carbon store we took for granted is actually being depressed by the pests. So there's one area where urban New Zealand should align with provincial and rural New Zealand with a good outcome for all future generations. We will make this task easier if we don't have pests chewing away at our carbon stores. Secondly, around water, particularly the nearshore and coastal estuaries, there is no doubt that we need to clean up our act in what we as human beings disperse into the nearshore environment. And that means we need to be prepared to regulate and fund the infrastructure so we are not doing further damage to the estuaries and foreshores of New Zealand. And in addition, we need to take seriously the science and understanding of the degraded wetlands and the capacity that we have through reinstatement to first stop emissions and then potentially add to carbon store. And so there are some very practical things that are special to New Zealand, where the alignment of interests with climate and restoring or preserving biodiversity can form the same agenda. But we have to be prepared through regulation and funding to make the resources available, or these things will not happen.
Thank you. Simon, do you want to chip in on this one? No? Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Sarah and, from Ben. And the question really is, should we have a shift in mindset and government and business, and I guess society, about limits to growth, and talking about sustainable growth? So does anybody want to offer a view around that one?
Yes, I'll jump in.
Okay.
I think the first thing we have to remember is that what we mean by growth is many and varied in different parts of the world. So often what we use as a proxy for growth is this thing called GDP, gross domestic product, which is really just a measure of the extent to which we have monetized and measured busyness in our economy. It is not a good measure of well-being or welfare or sustainability. It is not in any way a measure of the distribution of costs and benefits in a society. So by focusing unduly on GDP and equilibrating that to some measure of growth, effectively what we're doing is flying a plane only looking at our speed, not looking at how much petrol we have left on board or what height or angle we're flying at. So let's come to why the fixation on GDP. One of the fixations on GDP is the monetized economy is what is taxable. And for as long as we keep rewarding politicians who promise us things beyond what we're willing to pay for today, we need to grow our way through measured taxable economies to meet the promises that we extracted from our democratically elected leaders. So there is a very interesting set of interacting stakeholders in this game between us as voters and consumers and earners and taxpayers and our elected representatives reflecting back the very things we've demanded and expected of them. So when people challenge the limits to growth, I think we need to understand that really we're talking about a different way of rewarding our elected leaders by holding them to account for what happens long after they are in office. Because at present, we don't. At present, we hold our elected leaders accountable for what they do for us in the very near term. So growth matters more if you have less. And so often people who want to talk about slow or no growth talk about it from a position of privilege and prosperity. It's not that attractive if you're stuck at the bottom. So you inevitably end up also having to engage in a conversation about how we distribute the current pie. Because the way we've addressed this issue for the last 50 years is to debate how we distribute the increase in the pie. And it is much easier to share the increase out than it is in a zero-sum game to redistribute the pie we baked last year. So I'm very interested in that conversation, but it needs very quickly to get from should we have growth or not to what do we mean by growth? How do we measure growth? And how do we make sure that the resources we need to have a more equal distribution of opportunity, wealth, and outcomes are made available? Those are questions of economics, of politics, and also of ethics and morality. But I think we are now needing those kind of conversations in a way that we have not had for the last 100 years.
Bronwyn, I'm sure you have a view on this topic.
I'm just interested in hearing my former boss and the governor of the Reserve Bank advocating for basic income or at least universal basic services. So if Rod can change, anyone can.
Thank you, Bronwyn.
I'll just leave it there.
Okay, Simon or Dean, do you want to have a view on this question, or should we move on to the next one?
I'm happy to move on.
Okay. Rod, it's obviously you're the centre of attention here. So a question from Kate, which is, if we want or need a 10% reduction in methane by 2030, given the contribution of emissions, how are we going to get there, really? And how do we address the criticism that the Commission's agricultural goals have missed the mark? And I put that in speech marks for you.
Yeah. So look, the first thing to understand is that Parliament, 119 of 120 members of Parliament in the previous coalition government, Parliament set the targets. The Commission didn't. There was one absentee the leader of the ACT Party chose not to be present that day. So we can say that it was unanimous that the biogenic methane target that was agreed by Parliament was a reduction in biogenic methane emissions from their 2017 level by 2030. And it's a reduction of at least. So there's always a challenge about how much more than. So what the Commission is empowered to do is to provide advice to the government of the direction of policy that would be consistent with emissions budgets and an emission reduction plan aligned with those statutory targets. So in our final advice, we said that about 90% of biogenic methane emissions in New Zealand today come from ruminant pastoral agriculture. And that if we get some land use change towards forestry, about 50,000 hectares a year, and we get the better breeding for low emission traits, which we know how to do, and farmers are usually willing to accept breeding for traits. And we get the better farm practices in terms of dry matter conversion to milk and meat protein adopted more widely, then the 90% of ruminant pastoral biogenic methane emissions is expected to decline by in the order of nearly 11% by 2030 from its 2017 levels. In addition, we expect to get a 25% reduction in the other 10 percentage points, which is mainly by better managing landfill and gas capture with known technologies. And that overall gets us nearly a 12 percentage point reduction in biogenic methane, which is 20% more than the statutory target. So all of that says to us, I don't think we've given anybody a free pass. There are certain circumstances in which that target of a 10% reduction could be reviewed. Either the minister may trigger a review by asking the Commission, in light of new science or new evidence, to review the target, or under certain circumstances, the Commission can initiate a review of the target. In our view, those conditions have not been met at this time. So the challenge now is for that sector to develop plans that give measurable, auditable, permanent reductions in biogenic methane from ruminant pastoral agriculture, and for those who operate and run landfills to get a 25% reduction in biogenic methane from our waste streams to landfills. So the science is there, the technology is there, the partnership Heiwaka Ekanoa with the agricultural sector is endeavouring to create an inclusive consensus around how this can be done so that the decisions will stick, because the last thing we need is the flip-flopping as governments change that holds out the promise of denial and delay being rewarded for the rest of this decade, as it has been in agriculture for the past 20 years.
Dean, do you want to add to the sort of response given Ngāi Tahu's, and you, I think, talked about this earlier, its commercial operations?
Specifically in relation to
yes,
biogenic methane.
Yeah, and what Ngāi Tahu is thinking about to get that reduction by 2030.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, you know, the first thing, you've got to make values-based decisions, which is primarily to us, and then have a commitment to it without anyone sort of saying you shall do. So so that's a first big step in making sure that we really truly are. And some of this is a bit of trial and error in how we go this, and some of it's, like I said before, around partnering with people to come up with solutions. So certainly we've partnered with people to say, how do we remove all synthetic fertilizers? Because downstream, it takes a whole lot of stuff to create synthetic fertilizers, which aren't entirely good. So let's remove our need for those. So that's underway. Obviously, I mentioned before around doing significant trials in regenerative agriculture, and then also really working closely with mana whenua, who is Ngāitua Huriri in this case, around what does, how do we integrate mātauranga Māori into the farms and our solutions to therefore, and then track our biogenic methane. We track, we know our baseline for Ngāitahu across all of our businesses, whether that be trucking, tourism, seafood, farms, etc. And we know how we have reduced our impact on the environment from our 2017 baseline and our continual commitment to do those. I'm sure not everything's going to succeed in that, but I think the first bit is having a commitment to doing those and continue to work with partners in the community to go, right, how do we challenge this some more? Okay, so that didn't work, let's go again. We do have a society, our communities that we are an agricultural society in many respects. So how do we continue to, and there is many great things about that, around that community. So how do we continue to lead the drive for ways to reduce that biogenic methane?
Okay.
I hop in there just for a minute, Ian, just to say, I think also there's the politics element of this is hard but not impossible, because when we're thinking about shared values, one of them is fairness. And the difficulty that we've got at the moment is that the current really quite limited restrictions on agricultural methane, biogenic methane, don't seem fair for the community. But this is where Simon's work comes in about transport as well, because at the same time, and I know from having seen some of the questions that got mailed in earlier, that there are some teenagers from farming families on the line, and talking to teenagers in farms, a lot of farming communities, and especially teens, are feeling very victimized. They're feeling not understood. They're really tense. They're feeling blamed for everything. Now, if that carries on, we have a really big problem. So at one level, because people become absolutely resistant to change and they're defending their identity, that's Carrie Norgaard's really thoughtful intervention. So at one level, we have incentivized the dairy industry to convert to land use. So we have to think about, as a country, how we incentivize the reverse. At the same time, the dairy industry, so while the community needs to see, who are not farming, needs to see farming do their bit, at the same time, farming needs to feel that the urban community is doing their bit. And we are increasingly polarized on this. I am worried about it. And that's why I think a lot of Simon's work around transport is unlocking a separate conversation that has to come at the same time. So we are all doing our bit, and the outside of agriculture, it's transport is the biggest, fastest run on the board we can get. But also it can help us live better lives.
I couldn't agree more, Bronwyn. We all need to show to do our piece in that. And I come from farms. My wife comes from a farm, and a farm that had been in their family for 150 years, who love the environment because it has been their lifeblood. It has raised their children and their grandchildren and raised their community, and they're very passionate about the environment. Now, is there change that's required? Of course there is change that's required. But whilst my urbanite, colleagues around this call and others are on their cell phones that are downloaded with copper and lithium and driving their cars all over the place, I challenge us all to get off those and start to actually pay our dues in relation to our fair share of the deal on this. And I could not agree more. We all should take accountability and put the car away, get on your pushy.
Right. Next question is from Sarah, and I think we've had a bit of a version of this previously, which is around how is research and knowledge from universities across various disciplines being translated into decision making? And I think we sort of talked about that at central government, but this question has got a slight twist to it, which is around how does that information get translated into local government, where potentially local government is having a more direct impact on our daily lives. So does anybody want to pick that one up? And Simon, I might ask you, have you got thoughts on this?
Yes, I thought the question might answer this for us, actually. It's a really interesting one because you're right. Let's take the example of the Innovating Streets project where the central government put up money, local council got it, and at the end of the day, in many cases, it was local elected officials who withdrew the projects. And I think it's a tricky one because there's a lot of fake news, and in Christchurch we see some councillors just posting stuff on social media and being reported in the media, and they're just saying absolute nonsense, and to some extent they need to be held accountable for that, and they need to say where's your evidence. But it's a very popular thing to say, and I think Dean touched on some of this stuff. You know, it's very easy to sort of, it's very easy to say, oh, you're all greenies and there's no evidence and people should be entitled to their cars and all this sort of thing. And actually we've got to change that mindset and we've got to question that. And I think we need to take opportunities to go into council and speak when we can. So as academics doing research, we need to go in and speak. I think the climate march was fantastic, and I think young people need to go in and support some of these conversations as well, because I think they can have significant impact. And when politicians are challenged with evidence and with a lot of voices, they might hopefully start making better decisions some of the time. It's a real challenge though. But I think there is a lot of evidence, as you've said, Sarah, there's a lot of evidence out there that supports all the stuff we've been talking about today. And sometimes local council and local government don't back it. And it's a big challenge. That wasn't a very good answer, wasn't a very helpful answer, was it?
No. Bronwyn, do you want to talk about this? You're on mute.
No, I'll let it go at the moment. Thanks.
Okay. Rob, you obviously are providing advice to central government, but do you have a view on how knowledge is translated to local government? Or is it being translated to local government?
So I'll pick up a couple of dimensions of that. First of all, there are over 70 territorial authorities in New Zealand. So local government is very diverse around New Zealand, from the large unitary authority that is in Auckland to some of the smallest local authorities that really struggle to get $1 million a year in rates from their ratepayers. So the first thing is local government is made differently all over New Zealand, has different financial capacity, different technical capability, and will have different emissions profiles and electorate interest as well. So it's really hard to talk about it as a homogeneous group. Secondly, the emissions that local government create are relatively modest in the sense of the emissions from their own activity, but their regulatory capacity to change the emissions in their rohi is significantly larger. So they are a point of leverage. They're also often buyers of materials and have significant ability to influence the emissions from their supply chain, which is a bit of what Dean was saying about who you buy from, who you partner with, can actually be very influential beyond what you do as a business or a local government. But finally, I would make the pitch that I think local government is right in the forefront of the adaptation challenge. And if you think emissions reduction is contentious, wait till we have the conversations about who is going to bear the costs and where the losses will lie from adaptation. We will not be able to compensate all the losers. And I think that's going to be a bigger challenge for New Zealand society than emissions reduction.
Okay. Let's move on to the next question at the top, and that's from Jack. And effectively, COVID has demonstrated that we can have elimination strategies, and it was we've gone through, I guess, a social solution to a crisis. So why can't we have a social solution to the climate change crisis instead of putting hope and money into research and developing new technologies? So who would like to offer a view or some commentary on that? Can we?
I'll say hi, Jack. Jack Heinemann. Hi, nice to connect again. Look, I think the answer is it's not either or. I mean, we are going to need every tool in the toolbox to get this job done. We are going to need collectivism and collective action. We're going to need individual responsibility. We're going to need technology and science. I would hate to think we thought this was a choose one or the other. The Climate Change Commission was very, very clear that in our first 3 emissions budgets, we are not banking on any silver bullets or fairy dust or flu powder to get us out of this problem. New Zealand has got known technologies that if we choose to and deploy them at scale, at pace, we can make a material reduction in our emissions. And it's going to require collective action, leadership at the national level, as well as markets and prices and producers and consumers and investors making better choices. And it's going to require all of it quite soon, like now. So, Jack, welcome aboard. Yes, harness collective action, learn from COVID, but I wouldn't be relying on an either-or strategy.
Bronwyn.
Oh, you go, Simon.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, the thing that I'm quite worried about, though, is that what the great line that about relying on a carbon-sucking tooth fairy. Now, I have to be careful because Ian's specialty, when he's not being DVC for academic, is also in carbon capture and technology. But I'm more thinking about the wishful thinking around new technology, which is why I was so pleased that the Climate Commission came out quite strongly to say that we have the technology that we need now. Carbon capture and storage is technology that we are going to need, but it's going, but solar radiation management, some of the geoengineering solutions, I mean, solar radiation management, which is like spraying sulfates into the air, when you stop and think about it, it's incredible that we have got ourselves to the point where some people are arguing that it's easier to dim the sun than it is to change our economic systems collectively to get a better outcome. And actually just dimming the sun and practicing in the Pacific, as there are very strong pressures and lobby groups to do, has huge consequences for our biodiversity, for our life on Earth, huge risks. So I think while it's not an either or, I think we have to take a very strong ethical and philosophical position over the kinds of risks that we're prepared to take as a country and what kinds of collective behaviour changes we need. And we need those conversations right now, because it's so easy to come in, thank you, Bill Gates, with the whiz-bang technology promise without actually looking at, well, hang on a minute, what can we already do and what's the risk that's embedded in what we've already got. But sorry, Simon, I didn't mean to speak over you.
Simon.
Yeah, I mean, in the transport field, it's interesting that I think there's still this perception that we can just electrify our entire fleet and technology will solve the problem. But first of all, we can't do it in time. So we might do it eventually, we can't do it in time. So we have to change behaviour. We have to change the way people travel. We have to travel less. And actually, we know that if you create the right environments, people do choose to make different decisions. But we have to create the right environment. So you just have to look at the Netherlands. The people in the Netherlands don't cycle because they're different to us. They cycle because it's really nice to cycle. And we create communities where that's the best way to travel. So you're right. We don't want to just say that we need autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles will solve it. We actually need to change the way we're behaving. And it's not that different, but it does need a change in investment. It does need a change in political decision making. And you're right, as Rod said earlier, we should have done it 20, 30, 40 years ago. But if we're not going to do it, then we've got to start today.
Yeah, and I don't want to be a Luddite, because a lot of the technology we do need, I'm saying this very conscious that in the next office had here at home is my mechanical engineering Hamilton Jet husband talking about the electrification of the Ngāi Tahu boat. So, you know, technology matters, but it's the risks that we need to think about of the big geoengineering product, which is holding out false hope and kind of a delayed magical thinking that is not, that's allowing us to not actually face the crisis that we're in now. That's the part that I'm worried about.
Dean.
The question was around social solutions, and Bronwyn's husband, who's clearly next door, is making my Hamilton Jet electric jet boat working for our Ngāi Tahu jet boats. But why did we build an electric jet boat? And I reflect on what makes up social solutions. Are they not values? Is it values that makes up society? Is it not people that makes up society? And if then it's people that makes up society, is it not the choices we make as people? And if it's those choices, where do we make those choices? And those are choices we have to make every day. We make them when we choose to drive somewhere, like Simon's, you know, passion. We choose them when we're at the supermarket and, you know, where we purchase our products from, and, you know, where they may have come from. Are they New Zealand grown versus imported? These are, you know, that we make these choices in the types of, you know, carpets we put in our house. Should we be using pure wool? Or the types of clothing we wear? Social solutions are based on values and people and the choices we make. And this, to quote our beloved leader, the team of 5 million can make those choices.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on then to a question from Glenn, which is the question around avoid or shift. And some of the avoiding may stick, as we've seen in lockdowns, but urban planning is not understanding what needs to happen now to get the shift. So Simon, and the question really is when are decision makers starting to realise this issue? And I guess that this is the tension that we've talked about previously between national initiatives but delivery at local level, and the angst and the anger, if it occurs, is at the local level. So Simon, do you want to kick us off on this question?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to, there is a lot of work going to try and change our cities to make them so that we can make better transport choices. There's a lot of work going on. Locally, we know that it's going to be really hard to sell, so we need to promote that better. One thing that will happen, and we'll start seeing in the next year or so, is funding will drive different decisions. So the reality is that for the last 50 years, 90% of our funding in transport has gone for road building, and you're going to see a significant shift in that. So there'll be far more money available for other things. I think you're going to see it's going to become legally easier to change streets. So at the moment, I think local politicians would say it's actually pretty difficult to do that, and it's politically unpopular. So I think there's going to be a lot of things happening. I think, though, underlying your question is that doesn't happen overnight, and we absolutely know that, which is why you're starting to see tactical urbanism, you're starting to see short-term shift, which is what the Innovating Streets project's about. So trying to create cycleways very cheaply by just reducing speed limits, those sorts of things. So some of that stuff will happen, but some of the other stuff inevitably takes longer. So as Rod keeps saying, and we're all agreeing, we need to start doing the stuff we can do now, immediately, and we need to start implementing the stuff that's going to take longer. We've got to implement that because it does take longer.
Can I just push you a little bit? Do you think consenting city council or district councils are considering urban planning for the next subdivision and transport and emission consequences?
They are now. There's now what the government's doing at the moment is they put all their policies through a thing called the climate implications of policy assessment. So the idea is that they basically say, what are the climate implications of this policy? And that's actually the reason many of you have seen some of the New Zealand upgrade programme main big roads were cancelled. The biggest one, because it completely failed by a country mile any climate emission targets. And so you might have read about a road called Mill Road. And there was a lot of work going in to show that this was just a bad project because it was going to result in huge increases in emissions. So the government is using these CIPAs to look at some of the policies. The problem as well is it's driven nationally, but then a lot of it's implemented locally, and it comes back to the questions that Sarah Templeton asked earlier. We need locally, we need good decisions being made, backed by funding and decisions at central government. And I think the funding decisions at central government are heading in the right direction. We then need them to be implemented locally as well. And aligning both of those up is really hard, because as we've seen, a lot of these decisions, when people start seeing even traffic speeds, I mean, I'm staggered at the moment when you see locally a proposal to reduce a speed limit from 70 to 60, and some people are up in arms about it. And you're just like, well, you know, this is really hard if people are going to have those sorts of attitudes. Somehow we have to change some of those attitudes. That's challenging.
Bronwyn, do you want to add anything to this response? Rod?
Well, I have a couple of pet projects I want to get in the public domain, and then I want to hear Simon reply to them. One of my pet projects, and it actually was part of the recommendations of the Climate Commission, is that one of and only one of the barriers to the use of public transport is price. I absolutely accept convenience, quality, frequency, all those things matter a lot, but price is one. So I reckon it'd be a great idea if everybody in New Zealand under the age of 25 was allowed to ride public transport for free. And I would also think that it would be good to set standards for local provision of public transport. There's no point in having something free that's not available or useful. So I'd be interested in Simon's response to that. And partly the theory is if you can get younger people to get through both their compulsory education, their education after compulsory education and first job, whatever sequence that happens in, without having to own and operate a privately owned vehicle, because public transport, where appropriate, is available, accessible and affordable, you begin to help set up new standards of behaviour. And we already give bloody free transport to the over 65, so I just say, and why not under 25s? And the second one is, why wouldn't you reduce the speed limits to 20 kilometres within 20 kilometres of schools, particularly secondary schools, to create an increase in safe cycling to school? And again, that would irritate some motorists, but it may encourage some parents and students to run the gauntlet with the cars on the roads before you've actually managed to build out all the safe cycling infrastructure.
Okay, so that's your first project, pet project.
I'm just interested in an expert like Simon responding.
Yeah. Okay, Simon.
So the under 25 one is, I mean, there's a lot of evidence that happened in the Netherlands. And the Netherlands, it was part of a way of giving something to students. And you're right, the suggestion is that you see long-term behaviour change amongst students because they get used to using public transport. That's been talked about. And in fact, at the moment, as we currently speak, I have a group of students working with one of the Environment Canterbury councillors looking at the long-term implications. So it's not just would they use it, it's what are the likely long-term behaviour changes, which is, I think, what you're touching on.
Yes.
The argument against it, which I don't know enough about it, but the argument against it is that if you have a pot of money, do you use it to subsidise public transport for a certain group of people, or do you use it to invest in making the whole system better? So that's where some people would argue against it. I'm not saying I do, I probably don't know enough about it, but that's the argument. They say, if you're going to spend, let's make a number, 100 million, giving free public transport to under 25s, are you better spending 100 million to make a service better? So that's where that argument sits. The lower speed limits near schools, I 100% agree we should lower speed limits. Actually, I think where the main focus of the area is where people are living. So in areas where people are living and they're not routes to get places, we should have much lower speed limits. At the moment, there is a rule that does not allow that, sadly, that the Waka Kotahi has. My understanding is that rule is being reviewed. The problem is, as we've seen, is there are some people who argue against reducing speed limits because they say it will slow them down. But of course, the very purpose of a lower speed limit is to slow them down. And of course, once you slow people down, their journey becomes longer and suddenly the alternatives become more attractive. So actually walking, cycling suddenly become more competitive. The problem at the moment is speed limits are based on safety. And there's a funny, bizarre ruling that says that you can only lower speed limits to the speed at which the traffic is already currently naturally driving. So speed limits are not a tool to reduce speed, they're a tool to maintain the speed at which traffic's going. Engineers can explain it. I think everybody knows it's done, and it is currently being reviewed, and I think it will be changed. So there is a lot of work going about reducing and making it easier to reduce speed limits. And I agree with you, but there are some bizarre rules that need to be changed to make that happen, which I gather are going through the process and will be changed. So I 100% agree with you. I think every community where people live, and that's the main focus of this community, should be maximum 30, and it would transform many communities, but we'll keep.
Can I hop in half a second as we're running out of time?
Oh, yeah.
Just say, I also really think one of the questioners had asked about the micro solutions of e-scooters. As somebody who nearly died on an e-scooter, I would definitely say that you can't personalize the risk, that actually our public transport systems are our safest. Universal in an aging population, the universalized approach is really important, which is another reason why I'm grateful that Simon's team of students are looking at the long-term shifts in behavior that happen once you develop the habit of using transport. And if it requires, more exciting looking buses, that's good, a better service, but there are so many social justice reasons for making transport free for the under 25s straight away. That from my point of view, it's a political no-brainer, but thanks for explaining the hesitation, Simon.
And I also add as a comment from Sarah Templeton saying there should be the pot of money for public transport should be bigger. Absolutely it should, so that should not be an issue. I think we will see that pot of money for public transport getting bigger over the next few years, partly driven by the climate agenda, and I think the pots of money for other modes will start increasing as well. There's also a question about licenses. Another one, of course, that I think comes into it is it's actually very easy and cheap for teenagers to own cars and anyone to own cars. I grew up in the UK where insurance is the thing that stops you having a car when you're young because it's so expensive. So then we come into the whole issue of ACC and other things, and I don't know if that's just too big to take on, but it's very easy to own and drive a car at a very young age here because you don't pay the full risk of you driving it. So there's some other issues there as well, I think.
Okay, we are coming to the close and we are actually at 5 o'clock, but I'm going to stretch us just a few additional moments. There's one final question here, and I'm just giving heads up to the panel. You've got a 2-minute elevator answer to this. And the question is, how do we bring communities along in the decisions or policies that we need? Which is I guess the real gist of what this workshop or webinar has been about. So who wants 2 minutes to answer that question? I know it's a very unfair thing to do.
2 seconds. Shift it to a moral debate. What is fair and just, not a technical one. And also talk about the way we will live better together collectively, our values and our vision. Okay,
thank you, Bronwyn.
I'll just add to that, it's about talking about the co-benefit.
Sorry, Simon, you maybe go first.
Okay, I was just going to say, add in the co-benefits. And I think Bronwyn touched on that. This isn't just about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's also about creating communities which are nicer to live in and better to live in. Well-being's better, mental health's better, communities better, we're more resilient when natural disasters happen. All these other co-benefits, and I think we need to start selling them, but they are co-benefits of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, Dean.
I slightly disagree with Bronwyn's comment on what's fair and just, because what her view of fair and just is vastly different from what my view of fair and just is, and I don't think we'll ever find a way in the middle of it, to be honest. I think we'd end up going round in circles. However, in relation to how do we bring communities along the board, I have 3 children who are 5, 7 and 9. And like I say, I've been biking full time on an electric bike for 7 years. I've done that probably not for a carbon, initially not from a carbon planet thing, mainly because I was tight and I didn't want to buy my children cars. And I thought if they saw me biking every day, then therefore they won't want a car. However, now I've changed my viewpoint, and I'm hoping that because they see what my children see, typically what your children see their parents behave, then they will do that as well. It's a bit like state children who have always never could see themselves going to university. My dad's a builder, so I become a builder. My children see me riding a bike every single day and making choices around what is good on a values based. And I'm hopeful when my children are at those ages that they will be influencers or follow the same path.
Rod.
Absolutely agree with Dean about role modelling good behaviour, but I would also make the observation that there is no one in New Zealand who is either funded for or holds the mandate for public education on climate science, climate policy, or climate action. So it is falling to the universities and schools to essentially crowd in education about these matters. I think we need to do that, but we need to do a lot more. And I think the consequence of that is that the government needs to accept that in this fragmented world of social media, if we're going to get ahead of the denial and the obfuscation, we are going to need to fund high quality public education on these matters.
Okay. I'm going to wind the webinar up, and firstly I'd like to thank all 4 of our speakers. I know that you've put a lot of thought and preparation into your comments, and I'm sure we have all valued your thoughts and reflections and your willingness to answer on the hop, so to speak. I'd also like to thank everybody that's zoomed into this meeting. I understand that we have over 130 odd people that have zoomed in or registered. Hopefully you have found it interesting. And I think you'll get the sense that all 5 of us believe that a lot of the debate and the way forward is around social and economic equity and societal issues, in addition to just climate science and innovation. And I think that's where a lot of opportunity for research and implementation to ensure that New Zealand Aotearoa goes on this trajectory is absolutely required. Again, thank you for your participation, and I'm sure we will continue some such series again in the future. Thank you very much.